So a little recap on this little thing called the Boston Tea Party. So let me think. If we think back to the Boston Tea Party, why did it happen? Well, actually, after the king canceled the Townshend Acts that taxed everything that came to America from Britain, except for tea, the colonists calmed down. They were happy that they weren't taxed anymore on anything except for tea, because the colonists also got tea from the Dutch, who smuggled the tea into America. So the Americans didn't really care about the tea on tax because they had other sources who were able to sell them tea. So for a while, the colonists were calm. They didn't rebel, nothing. Everything was peaceful. That is, until something called the Tea Act. Dun, dun, dun. So Lord North, who was a British official in Britain, he was very high ranking next to the King of Britain. He noticed that the British Tea Company, the East India Tea Company, was failing because no Americans were buying tea from them. They were buying tea from the Dutch, the tea that was smuggled into America that was cheaper. So 17 million pounds of tea were just sitting inside of warehouses waiting to be sold. And the India Tea Company, the British East India Tea Company, was almost going bankrupt. So Lord North was like, I need to do something to help save this British tea company. What he did was he made the tea super, super cheap. Even cheaper than the tea that was smuggled in by the Dutch, which Lord North thought that would make Americans happy, right? The tea is cheap. But in actuality, it made the Americans angry because the Americans felt like the British, even though the tea was cheap, Britain was still trying to tax the Americans on the tea without their permission. Okay, and this made colonists mad. So even though the tea was cheap, they still refused to buy this tea from the British because they didn't want to be taxed even a little bit by the British without somebody talking to them about it first. So what they did is they went out in the middle of the night. Samuel Adams led the Sons of Liberty into the 3 boats that carried tea from Britain, and they threw over a bunch of barrels and cases of tea overboard into the Boston Harbor. And the Boston Harbor is where goods from overseas, so other countries, come to America, because America didn't make a lot of their own materials yet. They still got all of their materials from overseas, whether that was Britain or the Dutch, wherever they got it from, that was their trading port. So the Boston Harbor was a big deal. And that's where the British boats came with all the tea, and the Sons of Liberty, dressed up as Native Americans, threw over all of the tea in a sign of rebellion that they refused to buy tea from the British, because buying tea from the British means that they're also paying taxes on the tea. Now you might be wondering, why is this tea such a big deal? Well, it's kind of like the modern day coffee, right? A lot of Americans would be extremely annoyed if all the coffee was out of reach. They couldn't have coffee anymore, right? Most adults drink coffee first thing in the morning. And if they didn't get that, it would be a big deal. It's like closing up all these coffee shops in our area. But the Americans didn't want to buy the tea from the British because that means that they're also giving money to the British. So that's why the Boston Tea Party happened. As I was saying before I was cut off, you're not allowed to meet as citizens without British permission. So every time you want to gather with your friends for a meeting, you need to get the approval of the British soldiers or the British people in America who were in charge. This was so that the king could make sure that no meetings, make sure that Americans weren't meeting to talk about how to rebel, right? Scene change. So the Intolerable Acts, the final thing that it did and the king ordered was that all of the British soldiers who were arrested during the Boston Massacre were going to have their trial in Britain rather than in America. So if you remember the Boston Massacre, the Americans were throwing ice pellets at the soldiers, the British soldiers, and the British soldiers felt assaulted. One of them yelled fire and ended up killing approximately 5 people in the American crowd. This caused the American colonists to uproar, right? Essentially say that the British soldiers were absolutely wrong. They should have never fired, never killed anyone. But the British soldiers, in their mind, they were saying that the American colonists were rioting, right? And they were assaulting the British soldiers. So whose fault is it? Up in the air, right? That's for you to decide. However, the British soldiers who were arrested in America were going to have their trial in Britain, and the American colonists believed that if they had their trial in Britain, the British government were going to be nice to them because the British government does not like the American colonists. But the American colonists felt like the British soldiers should be tried in America so that they actually get the punishment that the Americans believed that they deserved. So this is all a really hard situation for the American colonists, and they are not happy.